The morning sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Fire Chief Rodriguez walked through the quiet halls of Pine Ridge Fire Station. The worn coffee mug in his hand had seen countless early mornings just like this one, but something felt different today. The air was unusually dry, and a strange stillness hung over the mountain town. Looking out the station's window, he could see the dense forest that surrounded their small California community. The trees, usually a symbol of natural beauty, now stood as silent guardians holding a potential threat. The past few months had been the driest in recent memory, turning the once lush landscape into a dangerous tinderbox. Rodriguez had spent 15 years with the fire department, working his way up from a rookie firefighter to becoming the chief. Every step of that journey had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming at him. He pulled out his phone and checked the weather app again. No rain in sight for the next 2 weeks. In the station's kitchen, the smell of breakfast filled the air as his team started their day. The sound of friendly banter and clinking plates brought a small smile to his face. These people weren't just his colleagues, they were family. Through countless emergencies and sleepless nights, they'd formed bonds stronger than steel. "Chief, you might want to see this," called out Lieutenant Thompson, one of his most experienced team members. She stood by the weather monitoring station, pointing at the humidity readings. The numbers were lower than they'd seen all summer, hovering at a dangerous 15%. Rodriguez walked over, his coffee forgotten on a nearby desk. "Get everyone in the briefing room," he said quietly. "We need to talk about this." Within minutes, the team gathered around the large table in the briefing room. Maps of the surrounding area covered one wall, marked with evacuation routes and water sources. Pictures of past fires served as silent reminders of what they were up against. "Listen up, everyone," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "We're looking at critically low humidity levels. The forest is drier than I've seen in my entire career. One spark, just one, and we could have a serious situation on our hands." He walked over to the map, pointing out the areas of greatest concern. The town of Pine Ridge sat nestled in a valley, surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides. Beautiful under normal circumstances, but now a potential disaster waiting to happen. "I want extra patrols today," he continued. "Check all our equipment twice. Make sure every hydrant in town is accessible and working properly. And most importantly, start thinking about evacuation scenarios." The team nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They'd all seen the news reports about devastating wildfires in other parts of California. The destruction, the loss, the communities forever changed. It could happen here too. Throughout the day, Rodriguez supervised as his team ran drills and checked equipment. The familiar sound of air tanks being filled and hoses being tested echoed through the station. Every piece of gear needed to be perfect. Lives could depend on it. In the afternoon, he drove through town, noting potential trouble spots. The Mountain View Senior Living Center caught his attention. Its location on the outskirts of town could make evacuation challenging if a fire approached from the wrong direction. He made a mental note to review their emergency protocols. Back at the station, he spent hours updating evacuation plans and coordinating with neighboring fire departments. The work was methodical but crucial. Every detail mattered when lives were at stake. As evening approached, Rodriguez stepped outside the station one last time. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, and a warm breeze carried the scent of pine needles. It was hard to imagine that this peaceful scene could transform into an inferno with frightening speed. Walking back inside, he heard the weekend crew arriving for their shift change. Fresh faces, ready to protect their community through another night. Rodriguez briefed them thoroughly, emphasizing the dangerous conditions. "Remember," he told them, "we're not just firefighters. We're the thin line between our community and disaster. Stay alert, stay ready, and most importantly, stay safe." As he prepared to head home, Rodriguez took one final look at the weather readings. Still no change. The knot in his stomach tightened. Years of experience told him something was coming. He just hoped they were ready for whatever nature had in store. That night, as he lay in bed unable to sleep, Rodriguez thought about his team, his town, and the responsibility that rested on their shoulders. Tomorrow would bring another day of vigilance, another day of preparation, because in their line of work, being ready wasn't just important, it was everything. Little did he know, the next few days would test their preparation, their courage, and their determination in ways they never imagined. The calm before the storm was about to end, and when it did, their lives would never be the same. The day began like any other at Pine Ridge Fire Station, but that sense of normalcy wouldn't last long. Chief Rodriguez was reviewing morning reports when the first lightning bolt split the cloudless sky. It was a rare sight, lightning without rain, and it sent chills down his spine. The weather phenomenon locals called dry lightning was every firefighter's nightmare during fire season. The emergency radio crackled to life. Station 1, we've got smoke reported in Sector 7 near Eagle Ridge. Multiple witnesses confirming. The dispatcher's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Rodriguez recognized all too well. Copy that, he responded, already moving. His team was gearing up before he even hit the alarm button. They'd sensed it coming too. The sounds of boots hitting the floor and equipment being grabbed filled the station as everyone moved with practiced precision. This is what we've trained for, Rodriguez called out as his firefighters climbed into their trucks. Remember your training, watch each other's backs, and stay alert. Conditions are perfect for this thing to grow fast. The convoy of fire trucks wound their way up the mountain road, sirens piercing the afternoon quiet. Through his windshield, Rodriguez could see the first wisps of smoke rising above the tree line. It looked deceptively gentle from a distance, like someone had lit a campfire. But he knew better. In these conditions, even the smallest spark could become a monster. As they rounded the final bend, the true scale of the situation became clear. The lightning had struck a tall pine tree, and the fire was already spreading through the bone-tree underbrush. The flames danced from tree to tree, growing more confident with each leap. Get the hoses deployed now, Rodriguez ordered, his voice carrying over the roar of engines and the crackling of flames. Priority is containing the spread. Watch for spot fires. His team moved like a well-oiled machine, each person knowing their role without needing to be told. Lieutenant Thompson coordinated the water supply while other firefighters began creating fire breaks. The sound of chainsaws filled the air as they worked to clear potential fuel from the fire's path. The heat was intense, and sweat soaked through their protective gear within minutes. But something wasn't right. The fire wasn't behaving normally. Instead of spreading in a predictable pattern, it seemed to have a mind of its own, jumping in unexpected directions. The dry conditions they'd feared were creating a perfect storm. Chief, one of his firefighters called out, "We've got spotting half a mile ahead." Spotting, when burning embers are carried by the wind to start new fires, was their worst-case scenario. Rodriguez looked up to see embers floating through the air like evil fireflies, each one capable of starting a new blaze. The radio crackled again with more reports of new fire starts. What had begun as a single lightning strike was quickly becoming multiple fires, threatening to surround them. The wind, previously calm, was beginning to pick up, driving the flames faster than anyone had anticipated. Rodriguez keyed his radio. "Dispatch, we need additional resources immediately. All available units." This fire is growing exponentially. He paused, knowing his next words would change everything. "And put evacuation teams on standby. This could reach the town." The next few hours were a blur of heat, smoke, and constant movement. The firefighters worked tirelessly, their faces streaked with soot, their muscles aching from the endless work of dragging hoses and clearing brush. But for every spot they contained, two more seemed to spring up. As the sun began to set, the scene became even more apocalyptic. The flames cast an orange glow across the landscape, turning the smoke-filled sky into something out of a disaster movie. But this wasn't a movie. This was real, and real lives were at stake. "Chief, look at this," Thompson called out, pointing to her tablet showing the fire modeling predictions. The images showed what they'd all feared. The fire was on a direct path toward Pine Ridge, and it was moving faster than anyone had expected. Rodriguez studied the map, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he knew he had to make. The fire had grown too large too fast. They couldn't stop it. They could only try to direct it and save as many lives as possible. "All units, fall back to defensive positions," he ordered over the radio. "We're switching to structure protection and evacuation support. This is no longer about stopping the fire, it's about saving lives." As the crews retreated to their new positions, Rodriguez took one last look at the advancing wall of flames. The Ridge Fire, as it would come to be known, was just beginning its devastating march toward Pine Ridge. In the gathering darkness, the fire seemed alive, a hungry beast awakening from a long slumber. The night ahead would push them all to their limits, testing their training, their courage, and their determination. But as Rodriguez looked at his tired but resolute team, he knew one thing for certain. They would face whatever came together, as they always had. What they didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. The true test of their courage and sacrifice still lay ahead, as the Ridge Fire prepared to unleash its full fury on their beloved community. The red and blue lights of police cars flashed through the smoke-filled streets of Pine Ridge as Chief Rodriguez coordinated with local law enforcement. The evacuation order had been given, and now the race against time began. The fire that had started just hours ago as a single lightning strike had grown into an unstoppable force, and it was heading straight for their town. "We need to go street by street, house by house," Rodriguez told the assembled team of firefighters and police officers. "Some folks won't want to leave their homes. Be firm but compassionate. We don't have time for long conversations." The sound of emergency sirens mixed with the distant roar of the approaching fire. Police cars drove slowly through residential areas, their loudspeakers broadcasting evacuation messages. The words echoed off empty buildings. "This is a mandatory evacuation. Please leave immediately. This is not a drill." Inside the fire station's command center, Rodriguez watched as red dots on the digital map showed the fire's rapid advance. Each dot represented a spot where the fire had jumped their containment lines. The pattern was clear. They had maybe 2 hours before the fire reached the town's outer edges. A young police officer burst into the command center, his face streaked with sweat. "Chief, we've got a situation at Mountain View Senior Living Center. Their evacuation buses haven't arrived, and they've got over 60 residents who need help getting out." Rodriguez's heart sank. The senior center was on the far side of town, directly in the fire's path. He grabbed his radio. "This is Chief Rodriguez. I need status on those evacuation buses for Mountain View, over." The response crackled back through static. "Chief, the buses are stuck on Highway 23. The fire jumped the road. They can't get through." Time seemed to stop for a moment as the implications sank in. 60 elderly residents, many with mobility issues, and no way to get them out. Through the command center's window, he could see the sky turning an ominous orange as the fire approached. "Get me every available vehicle we have," Rodriguez ordered. "Ambulances, police vans, personal cars, anything that can transport people. And I need volunteers who can help carry residents who can't walk." The response was immediate. Firefighters who'd just returned from the front lines, exhausted and smoke-stained, stepped forward without hesitation. Police officers radioed in, offering their patrol cars. Even local citizens who hadn't yet evacuated began showing up at the station, keys in hand, ready to help. Rodriguez led the convoy toward Mountain View. The smoke was getting thicker now, reducing visibility to just a few yards. They could hear the fire's approach. A deep, threatening rumble like an oncoming train. The heat was intense, even through the closed windows of their vehicles. At the senior center, staff members were doing their best to keep residents calm. Some elderly residents clutched small bags containing precious photos and mementos. Others sat in wheelchairs, confused by the commotion but trusting in their caregivers. "We need to move fast, but stay calm," Rodriguez instructed the assembled rescue team. "Priority goes to those who can't walk on their own. Remember your training, protect their airways from the smoke as best you can." What followed was a demonstration of humanity at its finest. Firefighters gently carried residents downstairs when the elevators were shut down for safety. Police officers helped guide those who could walk to waiting vehicles. Local volunteers comforted frightened residents, holding their hands and assuring them everything would be okay. The smoke continued to thicken, and ash began falling like gray snow. Through it all, the rescuers worked methodically, checking each room, making sure no one was left behind. The sound of the approaching fire grew louder, and the heat more intense. "How many more?" Rodriguez called out, helping an elderly man into a police car. "Just a few," came the response from inside. "Second floor is clear, working on the first floor now." Suddenly, a massive tree near the building burst into flames, sending sparks showering down around them. The fire was getting closer much faster than they'd anticipated. Rodriguez could feel the heat building, could hear the windows starting to crack from the thermal stress. "Everyone out now," he ordered. "Bring whoever you've got, and let's move." The last few residents were rushed out as burning embers began landing on the building's roof. As the final vehicle pulled away, Rodriguez did one last check of the building himself, running through smoke-filled hallways, calling out, making absolutely certain no one was left behind. The convoy of vehicles, loaded with residents and staff, made its way through the smoke-choked streets. Rodriguez brought up the rear, watching through his rearview mirror as the fire began to engulf the senior center building they'd just evacuated. But their job wasn't done. As they drove the residents to safety, Rodriguez's radio crackled with more urgent messages. Other parts of town still needed help, and the fire showed no signs of slowing down. The night was far from over, and more challenges lay ahead. Looking at the line of vehicles ahead of him, each one carrying precious human cargo to safety, Rodriguez felt a mix of pride and determination. They'd saved these lives, but there were more people who needed help. The evacuation of Pine Ridge was only beginning, and every minute counted. Back at the temporary command post, Chief Rodriguez stared at the satellite imagery on his tablet. The evacuation of the senior center had been successful, but now they faced an even bigger problem. The fire had split into two fronts, creating a deadly pincer movement around the town. The northern escape route was already cut off, and the southern route wouldn't stay open much longer. His radio crackled with static before a desperate voice broke through. "Chief, we've got confirmation of residents still in the Canyon View area. Repeat, civilians trapped in Canyon View. They're not responding to evacuation orders." Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten. Canyon View was a small cluster of homes tucked into a remote corner of their jurisdiction. The roads there were narrow, winding, and surrounded by dense forest. It was exactly the kind of place firefighters dreaded during a wildfire. "How many people are we talking about?" he asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "At least 12 houses still occupied, Chief, mostly elderly residents who didn't want to leave their homes. Some families too." The command post fell silent. Everyone knew what those numbers meant. They also knew that department protocol strictly prohibited sending crews into such a dangerous situation. The risk was too high, the chance of success too low. Rodriguez walked to the window, watching as the night sky glowed an angry orange. The air was thick with smoke, and ash fell like dirty snow. In the distance, he could hear the deep rumble of the fire, a sound that reminded him of a freight train, but one that never passed. Lieutenant Thompson approached, her face streaked with soot and concern. "Chief, I know what you're thinking, but protocol is clear on this. We can't send people in there. The risk is too high." Rodriguez nodded slowly. He knew the protocol. He'd helped write it. But he also knew something else, something that went beyond rules and regulations. Behind those numbers, 12 houses, maybe 30 or 40 people, were real human beings. Parents, grandparents, children. People who, for whatever reason, hadn't left when they should have. He pulled out his worn leather wallet and looked at the photo he kept there, his own family, smiling back at him from happier times. What if it was them trapped up there? "Get me the latest wind projections," he ordered, turning back to the command center's main table. The meteorologist quickly pulled up the data, showing wind directions and speeds for the next few hours. Rodriguez studied the patterns intensely, his mind racing through calculations and scenarios. They had a small window, maybe an hour at most, before the fire would completely cut off Canyon View. After that, anyone still up there would be trapped. "I'm going in," he announced, his voice quiet but firm. "I need 4 volunteers. Anyone who comes understands this is completely voluntary. We'll be going against protocol. I won't order anyone to take this risk." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, hands went up. Not just 4, but nearly every firefighter present volunteered. Rodriguez felt a surge of pride, but also a heavy weight of responsibility. He chose his team carefully, the most experienced, the ones who knew the terrain best. As they geared up, he laid out the plan. They would take 2 engines, following the old logging road that might still be passable. It would be tight, dangerous, and they'd have precious little time. If anyone wants to back out, now's the time, he told the chosen team as they did their final equipment checks. Nobody moved. The youngest member of the team spoke up. Chief, my grandparents lived in a place like Canyon View. They were stubborn too. Would have stayed until the end if someone hadn't gone back for them. Rodriguez nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind those words. This wasn't just about following or breaking protocol. It was about who they were as firefighters, as human beings. As they climbed into their trucks, Rodriguez took one last look at the command post. The safe choice would be to stay here, to follow protocol, to accept that some people couldn't be saved. But that wasn't who he was. That wasn't who any of them were. The two fire engines crawled up the winding road to Canyon View, their powerful headlights barely cutting through the thick smoke. Chief Rodriguez gripped the steering wheel tightly, every sense alert for danger. Trees burned on both sides of the narrow road, their branches occasionally falling in showers of sparks. First house coming up on the right, his colleague called out from the passenger seat. Through the smoke, they could make out the shape of a two-story home. A car was still in the driveway, not a good sign. It meant the residents might still be inside. Rodriguez keyed his radio. Team 2, take the left side of the street. We'll take the right. Remember, quick but thorough. We don't have much time. The second engine's lights flashed in acknowledgement as they split up. The heat was intense as they stepped out of the engine. Even through their protective gear, they could feel it pressing against them like a physical force. The air was thick with smoke and embers, and the roar of the approaching fire filled their ears. At the first house, they'd found an elderly couple still packing photo albums. We're almost ready, the old man said, as if they were waiting for a casual pickup. Just need to get a few more things. Sir, we need to go now, Rodriguez said firmly but kindly, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. Right now. The photos will have to stay. The old man looked at him, about to argue, then saw something in Rodriguez's expression that made him nod. As they helped the couple into the fire engine, a shout came from across the street. Chief, we've got 4 more over here, family with kids. House by house, they moved through Canyon View. Some residents came willingly, finally understanding the danger. Others needed more convincing. One man refused to leave until Rodriguez showed him a thermal imaging camera reading of the approaching fire. The numbers finally made him realize what they were up against. The smoke was getting thicker and the temperature kept rising. Trees were now catching fire all around them. The sound was deafening. A combination of crackling flames, falling branches, and the deep, threatening rumble of the fire's approach. 5 more minutes. Rodriguez called out to his team. Then we have to go, with or without the last checks. They'd found most of the residents, but a few houses remained unchecked. The thought of leaving anyone behind twisted in his gut, but he knew they were running out of time. A crew member rushed up to him, breathing heavily. Chief, the Riverside house, we can't find the grandmother. Family says she lives in the back cottage, but we can't get through the smoke. Rodriguez looked at his watch, then at the wall of fire approaching from the north. The cottage would be hard to reach. It sat at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by trees. The exact kind of place that would be hit first when the fire arrived. Without hesitation, he handed his radio to his colleague. Get these people to safety. I'm going to check the cottage. Before anyone could protest, he was moving, ducking under smoke and dodging burning debris. The heat grew more intense as he approached the cottage. The surrounding trees were already beginning to catch fire, and visibility was down to just a few feet. Rodriguez dropped to his knees, crawling below the worst of the smoke. He'd found the cottage door locked. Using his Halligan tool, he forced it open, calling out as he entered. Fire department, anyone here? The cottage was small, just a few rooms, but in the thick smoke, every search took precious seconds. Then he heard it, a faint cough from the back bedroom. He found her there, an elderly woman trying to gather her medications. She was struggling to breathe in the smoke-filled room. I've got you, he said, helping her up. We need to go now. She nodded, unable to speak through her coughing. Rodriguez lifted her in his arms. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. The journey back to the engine was a nightmare of heat and smoke. Burning branches fell around them. The roar of the fire was now overwhelming, and the air itself seemed to be burning. Rodriguez's muscles screamed with effort, but he kept moving. The evacuation center buzzed with activity as Chief Rodriguez helped the rescued Canyon View residents find their way to medical checks and family reunions. His own muscles ached from the night's efforts, but there was no time to rest. His radio crackled constantly with updates about the fire's movement and new areas under threat. A young firefighter rushed up to him, face streaked with ash and worry. "Chief, we've got a problem at the old mill site. One of the mill workers went back to check on something. He's not responding to radio calls." Rodriguez felt his heart sink. The old lumber mill had been converted into a storage facility years ago, but it was still full of wooden buildings and machinery. With the fire approaching, it would become a death trap within minutes. "Did anyone see him enter?" Rodriguez asked, already moving toward his truck. "Yes, sir. The security camera caught him going in about 20 minutes ago. He was heading toward the main storage building. The mill site sat on the edge of town, directly in the fire's path." As they drove toward it, Rodriguez could see the massive wall of flames approaching. The wind had picked up, driving the fire faster than ever. The sky was a frightening mix of orange and black, with embers raining down like deadly snowflakes. "All units be advised," his radio crackled. "Fire front is moving at unprecedented speed. Estimated 10 minutes before it reaches the mill complex." Rodriguez parked the truck and grabbed his gear. The heat was incredible. Even from this distance, it felt like standing next to a massive furnace. The mill's buildings loomed ahead, dark shapes against the glowing sky. "I need 3 volunteers," he announced to his team. "We go in fast, we find him, we get out. No heroics." Hands went up immediately. He chose quickly, knowing every second counted. As they geared up, he could see the concern in their eyes. They all knew the risks. The mill was a maze of buildings, corridors, and storage rooms. Finding someone in there would be like looking for a needle in a burning haystack. "Start with the main storage building," Rodriguez ordered as they moved in. "That's where he was headed. Stay together. If anyone's air gets low, you head out immediately. No exceptions." Inside, the smoke was already thick. Their flashlights created eerie beams in the darkness, catching glimpses of stored equipment and supplies. The heat was building rapidly. Rodriguez could feel it even through his protective gear. They moved methodically through the building, calling out and listening for responses. Each room cleared was another precious minute gone. The fire's roar grew louder, and through the windows, they could see the orange glow getting closer. "Chief," one of his team called out. Fresh footprints in the dust, heading toward the back office. They followed the tracks, moving as fast as they dared. The back office area was a warren of small rooms and narrow corridors, perfect for trapping someone who didn't know their way out. Suddenly, they heard coughing. Following the sound, they found the mill worker in a small storage room, trying to gather documents from a filing cabinet. "Sir, we need to go now," Rodriguez shouted over the fire's roar. The man looked up, startled, as if only now realizing the danger he was in. "But the records," he started to say. "They're not worth your life." Rodriguez cut him off, taking the man's arm. "We're leaving. Now." They started back, but the situation had deteriorated rapidly. The heat was now intense enough to crack windows, and smoke was pouring in through every gap. Rodriguez could hear the fire moving through the building's wooden structure, creating an ominous creaking sound above them. Halfway to the exit, there was a tremendous crash. Part of the roof had collapsed, blocking their primary escape route. Rodriguez quickly assessed their options. The secondary exit was through the loading dock, but it would take them closer to the approaching fire front. "Masks on tight," he ordered. "We're going through the dock. Stay close to the wall, move fast, don't stop for anything." They made their way through the smoke-filled corridors, the heat growing more intense with each step. Rodriguez led the way, one hand on the wall, the other gripping the mill worker's arm. His team followed close behind, everyone connected by touch in the thick smoke. The loading dock doors were ahead when Rodriguez heard it, the distinctive sound of structural failure above them. He had a split second to react. "Move," he shouted, pushing the mill worker forward. His team and the worker cleared the area just as a massive section of the ceiling came down. Rodriguez dove, but not quite fast enough. A falling beam caught him, pinning his leg. "Chief," his team shouted, turning back. "Get him out first. Rodriguez ordered, pointing to the mill worker. "I'll follow." His team hesitated for just a moment, torn between their training to never leave anyone behind and their duty to follow orders. The fire was now visible through the gaps in the walls, and the heat was becoming unbearable. "That's an order," Rodriguez shouted. "Get him to safety." "I'll get myself out." They finally moved, helping the dazed mill worker towards safety. Rodriguez waited until they were clear, then began the painful process of freeing himself. The beam was heavy, and every movement sent waves of pain through his leg. The fire was entering the building now, moving with frightening speed. The air was becoming unbreathable even through his mask. With one final effort, Rodriguez pulled himself free. His legs screamed in protest as he stood, but he forced himself to move. The last 100 feet to safety were a blur of pain, heat, and determination. Just as he cleared the building, the entire structure began to collapse behind him. His team was waiting with medical gear, but Rodriguez waved them off. "Check him first," he gasped, pointing to the mill worker. "I can wait." The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain in his leg was becoming intense. But as he watched his team treating the shocked but largely unharmed mill worker, he knew it had been worth it. Another life saved, another family spared from tragedy. The night wasn't over yet, though. Even as the medics finally started treating his injuries, Rodriguez could hear more calls coming in on the radio. The fire was still threatening other parts of town, and there were more people who needed help. His leg would heal, but the memory of those moments in the burning mill would stay with him forever. It was a reminder of what their job was really about, not just fighting fires, but protecting lives, no matter the cost. 3 months after the Ridge Fire, Chief Rodriguez stood before a crowd gathered in the rebuilt town square of Pine Ridge. His leg was still healing. The doctor said he might always walk with a slight limp, but he was back on duty, doing the job he loved. The air was crisp and clean, so different from that smoke-filled night that had changed their community forever. The town had come together to honor its firefighters and first responders, but Rodriguez felt uncomfortable being called a hero. He knew the real story wasn't about him. It was about an entire community that had refused to give up when faced with disaster. Looking out at the gathered faces, he could see many of the people they'd rescued. The elderly couple from Canyon View, who'd been trying to save their photo albums, sat in the front row. Behind them was the mill worker, who now volunteered at the fire station's community outreach program. The grandmother from the cottage had baked cookies for the entire fire station every Sunday since the evacuation. As Rodriguez prepared to speak, his mind went back to that night. The heat, the smoke, the impossible decisions, the fear that gripped everyone. It all seemed both distant and incredibly close at the same time. But what stood out most in his memory wasn't the fire itself, but the countless small acts of courage he'd witnessed. "The Ridge Fire tested our community in ways we never imagined," he began, his voice carrying across the quiet square. "But it also showed us something important about ourselves. When things were at their worst, we came together. We looked out for each other. We refused to leave anyone behind." He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. Some had lost homes in the fire, others had barely escaped with their lives. Yet here they were, rebuilding, supporting each other, moving forward together. "People keep asking me about that night, about the decisions we made," he continued. "They want to know about running into burning buildings and driving through walls of flame. But the real courage wasn't in those dramatic moments. It was in the hundreds of small choices people made to help others." He thought about his team, who had volunteered without hesitation to go into Canyon View, about the local citizens who had offered their vehicles to help evacuate the senior center, about the countless acts of kindness in the days and weeks that followed as the community helped its members rebuild. "I see true heroes every day in this town," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I see them in the volunteers who helped clear debris and rebuild homes. I see them in the teachers who kept our children's spirits up when they were displaced from their schools. I see them in the neighbors who opened their homes to those who lost everything. A light breeze carried the scent of pine trees, new ones planted to replace those lost in the fire. Nature was already beginning to heal the scars on the landscape, just as the community was healing its own wounds. The fire took much from us," Rodriguez continued, "but it couldn't take our spirit. Every person who stayed behind to help someone else, Every one of you who came back to rebuild, you're the real heroes of this story." He looked down at the simple plaque they were dedicating today. It didn't just list the names of firefighters and first responders. It honored the entire community, recognizing that in times of crisis, heroism comes in many forms. "We've learned something important from all this," he said, his voice softening. "When people ask me how we saved so many lives that night, I tell them the truth. We didn't do it alone. Every person who helped evacuate a neighbor, every one of you who checked on the elderly couple next door, every kid who helped carry supplies or comfort a scared pet. You were all part of something bigger than yourselves." The breeze picked up, rustling through the new saplings planted along the square. Young trees that would grow strong, just like the community they represented. "The plaque we're dedicating today isn't just about remembering what we lost," Rodriguez concluded. "It's about celebrating what we found, our strength as a community, our capacity to care for each other, our ability to rebuild from ashes. That's the real legacy of the Ridge Fire." As he finished speaking, the crowd stood in respectful silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone started clapping. The applause spread, not in celebration of any one person, but in recognition of their shared experience and survival. Later that evening, as Rodriguez walked through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, he passed the rebuilt senior center. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange, a sight that once brought fear but now simply marked the end of another day of recovery and renewal. A young child rode past on a bicycle, waving to him, the daughter of one of the families they'd rescued from Canyon View. Her father had joined the volunteer fire department after the Ridge Fire, turning his gratitude into action. This, Rodriguez thought, was the true measure of their success, not just the lives saved that night, but the way those lives had become part of the larger story of their community's resilience and renewal. The Ridge Fire had tested them, but it had also shown them what they were capable of when they stood together. As he headed home, his leg aching slightly from the day's activities, Rodriguez smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve. But whatever came, he knew this community would face it the same way they'd faced the fire, together, with courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to looking out for each other.